it more. And your first floor cafe expression, which is supposed to be the more open architecture, the material quality of it and the punched openings that you're creating on the first floor don't really make that the simplicity and monumentality of the second floor.
Yeah, it doesn't match your narrative was strong in terms of making this distinction between the public cafe and then this sort of semi-public common space, and the need in a hostel to have a clear separation between the public and the private. And I think I think to Eric's point that the first floor could read a little bit more in the rendering to what you were saying. The idea of having a screen up above, I would question too the size of the addition relative to the existing space that you have, and I think that it has to do with the choices to give up a lot of the existing space, which I think is it's a hard one. It's a hard one when I think of a hostel program, because I know that space is a real thing with a hostel program. You're traveling lightly, you're moving nimbly, and that to give up a lot of space in what's an existing a perfectly good existing shell. I would just question the size of the intervention, the outside intervention to the intervention.
Yeah, Mark, I agree with that thought. To follow with your thought there as well, the building doesn't begin and end where the sort of architecture ends. The building is comprised of the entire site. You could have continued site features out and actually held the corner more and actually defined the remaining perimeter space as both part of the cafe and also part of the exterior space. The notion that the vertical walls of your building perimeter define the edge of your scheme is not so correct. Hey, one other thought I had. I appreciated in your presentation your focus on the people of the neighborhood rather than simply just making a kind of formal response. You really were thinking about the people who are going to be living there, and then as well the relationship of the people to the neighborhood. I mean, we're critical of the way that you've done that, but your idea of focusing on people for architecture and then making that difficult transition to expressing and form these ideas is a humanist and very positive way to approach a program like a youth hostel, which is a very positive community-oriented function. So I think you did that well in your presentation.
All right. Well, thank you, Mari.
Thank you.
We should move on to the next one.
Okay. Thank you.
Lee?
Yes. Hi. Okay. So, my name is Lee, and this is my spring garden. So, my main goal in my design was trying to create these inner and outer courtyards adjacent to the brick sleeve. Try to achieve this by pulling in the facades on all the sides to create these different spaces. These subtractions on the first and second floors are also different to create a sort of overhang to provide some shielding against the elements. As you can see, the form is quite gestural, trying to pull in members of the community along the exterior walls into the main courtyard and into these exterior spaces. The appendages sort of categorize the spaces and divide the site into these three main interior courtyards and a couple of exterior areas. So you can see the main entrance is on the exterior wing with the lobby and the cafe on this other exterior wing, allowing for entrance from the more public access areas. And the inner areas are reserved for the dining area for the visitors. This form also creates a sort of branching and stemming from the shell outward, sort of metaphorically reaching out towards the community. And on the second floor, you can see that I utilized this pod system to fully maximize the area of the space with these windows juxtaposed at the ends of these wings, so that depending on which pod you are residing in, you could have a different adjacency to the brick shop. And the multitude of small communal spaces that are scattered throughout the program, encouraging small moments of interaction, such as this little space and a reading area in the back. And the more public areas are much more open in an attempt to foster a wider scale of interaction, such as this game area, as well as the dining area below, which connects to the on the outside. And as you can see in this section, I tried to articulate the fenestration in a way that reflects the form of the overall hostel. And these serve as a gesture to the more public open spaces, as well as the entrances to the building. In this, you can see a closer detail of the pod system that I tried to employ. And the roofs are also tried to articulate so that they slope upwards towards the ends of the appendages in an attempt to lead visitors down each wing to sort of explore each space on their own. And this was just a quick visualization of the first floor. You can see the relationship of the shell and the main entrance, as well as the curved glass and the interaction that could possibly be fostered in this largely open area. And that's pretty much it.
Good. Hey, I really appreciate the basic idea of your project. I think these organic forms as a whole contrast really nicely with the existing shell. And in plan, especially the way that this organic appendages sort of reach out from the inside to the outside is strong as well, especially on the inside. I think the resulting spaces that you've created would be very interesting. And again, the relationship of the new to the old would be clear. That being said, so congratulations. But that being said, I have a couple comments. First of all, I think the connection of your appendage in the left back corner where you have the stair and where it connects to the building is not strong or well developed at this point. Second of all, I think that you have a problem in section. You've conceptualized your building as A, an existing shell, B, appendage shape 1, and then 2, appendage shape 2 that's slightly bigger that's plopped on appendage shape 1. I would encourage you to think of the entire appendage as a volume and as a single piece that could goo and flow from the inside to the outside. You're thinking two-dimensionally and in plan on the existing drawings, and the section drawing shows the problem with the conception. As you play with the volumes, your two-story volume could go to one story. You could then take the void areas that remain and then express them with glass so that you can really read this appendage structure that you're creating as much more of a three-dimensional conception. Right now, it's rather two-dimensional. And then one last thought, Mark, and then sorry to monopolize a little bit here, but I'm critical of the two appendages on the outside, whereas I think the two shapes on the inside work really beautifully to create those three courtyards. Your whole idea of reaching out to the community, in my opinion, would have been made more clear with a single piece that would come out, or maybe a primary piece and a very small secondary piece. And then your exterior spaces, instead of being so split up, you could have had much more of an exterior space that would have connected the inside to the outside.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I'll take the point of view that so you've chosen to make a very heavy-handed, sort of non-referential design. And if you're going to do that, you have to be very careful about the expression of that sort of amorphous shape relative to the environment that you're placing it in. I think, to Eric's point, if you were talking about this element or this appendage coming from this existing industrial building, I would think at a minimum, it would have some reference to the overall street condition, the sight lines on the street, something that would then draw you in. And I'm not convinced, or at least it may be, but I don't know from this presentation. If I looked at this, if I looked at this board on the wall, I would have no context for why this shape on this site is appropriate. I think there's a lot of, you have two giant plans showing, let's say, the adjacent 2 or 3 blocks, but I don't really get an understanding of what those 2 or 3 blocks are doing to influence this particular shape. And I think even with the axons, the real estate for the presentation and the section in particular, I have an issue with the section that when I look at this section, all I see is the sort of mauve ground line. I don't look at the building. I'm looking at, roughly 25% of the space, and only 25% of that space represents the architecture. And if this was a vast open plain, and the sort of extent of the site had to be, just from a presentation point of view, if the extent of the site had to be sort of driven home, then maybe you would use that much real estate for it. But in an architectural presentation, often you're given only this limited window into your mind, and without your words to explain it, your ideas have to come across in a way that's supported by the drawings or the photographs or the documentation that you give. And I sort of feel that what you're saying and what I see on the paper are slightly misaligned. When you make a big gesture like this, there's a lot of responsibility to try to sort of justify it once you leave school. And there's nothing to say that you don't make those big gestures. I'm not discouraging those big gestures. I would just say that it's hard for me to understand the very rational nature of your plan in terms of the layout of the pods. They're very efficient. And then that in the context of the larger gesture. It's not to say that big shapes are not valid. It's definitely not to say that at all. It's just to say that you have to be able to convey the reasoning behind those even more when you make those big gestures. It's a hard argument to do those kinds of things, even in the context of not even in context of the client, but in context of the cityscape and in terms of the lasting sort of impression on the site. You know, they have to, if they're bold, they have to be bold, and they have to be justifiable. So that's my two comments.
Marco? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
There's one other comment too, is that it looks like the location of the entrance is sort of, there's one sort of on the front, but then there's another one in the back alley. And I actually, now that I think about the back alley, I have some other, even for some of the other presenters, I have some other questions about the back alley, but that's a different topic.
Sure. I'll piggyback on what you were saying, Mark, about the connection to the community. I would have, similar to one of the comments I made on one of the earlier projects, like to have seen a larger site plan. And these two pieces are coming out. It's clear when you look at the interior of the plan that you're not thinking of them as axes directed toward a view. But it's also clear, because there's 3 tiny courtyards on the outside, that you're not really truly thinking about the spaces on the outside that they form. So perhaps there is a connection to the resulting community, but as Mark said, with great power comes great responsibility, right? To quote Spider-Man. And you really haven't shown that so much. Second of all, the nicest thing about this scheme, in my opinion, is the sort of planar, is the expression in plan of the relationship of this organic form to this strong existing building. Yet I want to really emphasize the fact that the 3-dimensional nature of your form sort of undoes a lot of the good that you've created with this kind of gooey intervention, and especially the heaviness of it, where it crashes through the existing wall and comes out into the community as a big 2-story, 2 gooey forms stacked one above one another, does you no favors. I think a stronger expression of the wall, even continuously across the site in the front, and then having the form come through perhaps on the 2nd floor in a lighter way, or have it be varied more, again, so that this form is much more of a 3-dimensional conception. Then you would feel free to play with it, to vary it in response to the site and to the surrounding conditions and to the existing building in a more developed way. So the scheme simply needs more work and more development for it to sort of actualize the power of your party.
Lee, do you have any comment with regards to what you've been hearing from them?
I think I mostly agree with everything. Yeah, I do feel that the gestures that I tried to create could have been much stronger in trying to actually reach out to the community.
Hey, what's the material quality of this piece where it comes out?
I imagine them as white concrete masses.
Does the white concrete, it comes very close to the brick. Did you consider a very light curtain wall structure that might have contrasted more strongly with the brick and could have floated and danced perhaps a little more than this heavier load-bearing concrete structure?
That would make more sense.
Oh, I think the concrete might have worked. I'm just not seeing it expressed here. The advantage of the concrete is that you could create an architecture of poche with super thick walls that in places might be even, thicker than the existing building. Yet that aspect of a load-bearing structure hasn't been pushed by you. On the other hand, doing a light structure would, in a much more straightforward way, contrast with the heaviness and load-bearing quality of the existing wall.
I agree, Lee. I think if you were to spend a little bit more time on this after today, I would be more kind of intentional in the way that we understand materials with respect to the context and to the form of the building itself. And I do agree. I do agree with the comments of the of how the building is situated on the plaza, on the public plaza. Perhaps elevating just as easy as elevating. I mean, not easy, but elevating one of those branches up, to let the space go underneath. That would have been perhaps a feasible solution without necessarily losing square footage in case you need it, or without kind of perhaps modifying too much the rest of the building at this point. This is just some modifications to apply in the future. But yeah.
Yeah, I had one other thought too, and we were talking a little bit, Mark, you and I, about the section of the building and how it could have been pushed much more. It seems to me that those qualities of a building that you see in plan as students, but also in real life, you want to push ideas as far as you can, and the organics, flexible nature of your plan does not appear at all in this section. I would have liked to have seen some sort of more gestural connection to the outside, so that something of the activity and beauty of your organic shapes could have manifested themselves in the section drawing as well as in the plan. And that would have meant that in section, your new intervention would have contrasted much more with the existing walls, rather than just sort of disappearing.
When I look at the section, I see, when I look at the plans, I see this it's a bold shape, it's an amorphous shape. But when I look at the sections, I see two cakes. It's not
exactly
the same. And when I look at this particular section, if I can just focus in on the part that, once I get past the fact that there's so much blank space, if I look into that window where you're sort of peeking through you've rendered it as a gray space, which I'm not sure if that would be a gray space, but if there would be a material there or not. But what I see in this particular view is I see a window into something else that you haven't shown me, which is, if I look through and I see remnants, I think of brick there and this sort of swooping glass plane, I see it in 2 stories, but I don't know what happens on the other side of that wall. I want to see that. And you have 3/4 of the rest of the space to be able to explain, to justify why you've made those other decisions.
Exactly.
So, and I'm sure that in the model somewhere there is a view, and it may just mean that you have to spend some time to puff up the reading of those views. But in this particular, if you do a section and you make it gray, and then you have a color behind it, your eye says, what's that other thing, right? So that's in terms of a presentation, you have to think in terms of how the viewer is going to proceed through your presentation, the same way that how a person, a human, would experience a piece of architecture.
It's clear you're at a certain point in your development. What I do appreciate about this scheme is the boldness of your initial conception. And you don't have the skill yet as a designer to be able to express those thoughts clearly in section and in 3-dimensional form. Yet that will happen. But as you move ahead, I would encourage you to keep the boldness that you had in establishing that original idea, and just learn how to make your drawings and your presentations keep up, catch up to these bold ideas. So don't wimp out.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lee. Let's move on to Max. You ready? Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
Screen. Is it showing?
Yeah.
Yeah, just
yeah, okay. So yeah, as Manuel said, my name is Max, and with this hostel project, like the others, I was trying to look at ways to add life to the existing site, and also to an extent where the hostel program becomes a spectrum of public to private, rather than it being sort of binary and black and white. So with that in mind, I created a more internalized scheme where a large extent of the building footprint is located and manifests itself beyond the existing brick shell, while the pre-existing conditions from the are largely preserved. And in this case, the north and the west facade of the brick shell is like mostly preserved as it is, while the majority of the south facade is removed, except for this little portion right here. And the there are some on the east facade of the brick shell. There it's my new building protrudes it here and there, so it's also mostly manipulated. And as looking at the plan, what I with that concept in mind, what I begun was to sort of create this exterior facade that mimics the street curb, and with the existing vegetation, sort of hint at the entrance towards the courtyard of the hostel. And once you enter here, you can either go to the courtyard or enter to the hostel on the right. And there are two modes of circulation. One's here with a view outside to the courtyard, and one's down this hallway into these stairs over here. And on the first floor, mostly you can find the sort of semi-private to public program, where the cafe over here, the cafe is located here, and with seating outside to activate and interact with the more private courtyard condition. In the middle is a general, more gathering space with computer labs, library, and seating area along the facade, and also just seating area in the center. Down here, there's the cafe, which with seating to the outside attempts to activate the existing activate the street front, and while also make the idea of public to private more transparent in the hostel. And going into the second floor, the pods, sleeping pods are mostly arranged along the east facade and the interior elevations. And while the more semi-private program and the service spaces are located along the middle, right here. And there's outdoor seating, not outdoor, sorry. There's seating outside of the spaces here, and with a balcony looking out towards the large intersection. And you can visualize these this circulation a bit more in this axon diagram, and yeah, that's it pretty much.
Mark, you want to go, or do you want me to?
Yeah. So I think the first sort of overarching comment is that and this may be, it may be on the screen that I'm not able to see it, but I think from a drawing perspective, presentation perspective, it's very hard to read. It's very hard to read the plans, and this may be, it may be a sort of a minor line weight thing or a presentation thing, but it's very important when you do a presentation that the drawings are readable. And I can't really tell where the inside is of the building, or what's new versus what's left over. And I think it's just a mechanical sort of presentation thing that may be drawing, it's a sort of a drawback to what you're saying. I think from a planning point of view, when I look at, when I do zoom in on the other screen and see the plans, my first thought is that from a scale perspective, everything seems to be a little out of scale. That's the spaces are either, they're either much too generous. Even the staircases look like they're maybe 8 or 10 feet wide, some of them. And I guess from a planning point of view, even the idea to have one single corridor with all of the bedrooms sort of off of that corridor, it's a tough one, because it sort of reads like pens as opposed to something, in a hostel. I think you want to sort of be not thought of as another cattle, but have some sort of interaction with other people. Even if it means, I can see this a little bit better now. Yeah, I'm looking at some of the elements of the plan, and I'm just questioning this bathroom that looks like it's maybe 30 feet long and only 8 feet wide. How sort of, when you go to a hostel, you're sort of faced with another person very close, but then you have to sort of walk by them in this really narrow hallway to get to the shower or to the bathroom, and you might have to actually bump their shoulders because the spaces, these are purely sort of programmatic things, because I think on the other side of the presentation, I don't get a sense of the materiality of the building, even from these couple sort of collages that are done.
Yeah, I understand.
They're not really renderings. They're not renderings. They're simply collages. So the collages, when you look at a successful collage, there's 4 or 5 elements, and they sort of they pop, and you understand the main sort of things that are really important about looking at that view. Which, if I looked at the one with the green space, if just from a collage point of view, I would think lush grass. In the background, I would see brick, and maybe there's sort of interaction with people, right? So that's what that snapshot, if that's what you're trying to do, that's what that snapshot would do. And I think that these particular, the computer collages, they don't do justice to maybe something that's going on in your mind. And you may very well have those thoughts, and they may be valid. It's just that it's not coming through in this particular presentation.
Yeah, I understand.
This project reminds me of a lot of the projects that actually get built in Pittsburgh these days. And the problem isn't that there's too few ideas. You had a whole bunch of ideas regarding planning. The problem is that there's too many. And these ideas cancel one another out as you're drawing them, until the expression becomes so diffuse.
Yeah, it's watered down.
That it's really hard to tell what the meaning of the space that you're trying to create is. The way out of this for you in the future as you're designing is to rely on a much more this is an opinion, but much more of a partie-based architecture where you create a single idea that is the focus of your project that you can express either as a formal idea in model or as an idea, something where that serves as a forming device for making decisions down the road. Then what happens is that this singular idea ends up sort of forming a hierarchy of subsequent decisions that create an architecture. So I would have loved to have seen a small partie model that would have shown what your idea is. To back up just a minute, the idea of creating this large courtyard structure that exposes the existing walls of the building and then pushes the architecture, the new architecture, as far away from that as possible to create this large exterior courtyard. That's kind of a cool idea, but you didn't talk about it. And although I see the drawing on the outside, I see no material expression of the existing wall. And it's hard for me to believe that you believe in it.
Yeah.
Because you haven't talked about it, because you haven't drawn it.
If there was a video with a physical model where you actually saw the box and then it pulled apart, then at least you would understand where you were coming from and why you abandoned the existing space.
So this is what happens in real life. It's plan, 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 plan. And so many corporate architects especially end up doing these diffuse collection of plan ideas. And they're sincere about the meanings of these spaces and about the relationships between them. And they've thought very carefully about the connection of these planar plan elements to the outside, just as you have. Yet there's no glue. There's no sort of larger intent. There's no larger meaning. There's no larger connection to the community. There's no larger connection to the conditions of the existing site. And that's where you have to go. Back up from this sort of diffuse plan. Many of these ideas can come back in the future, but figure out where to hang your hat and then reformulate within that matrix.
Got it. Yep.
I agree with Mark's comment about the drawings too. Yep. They simply don't express the ideas of your project well. And you know, one's graphic facility develops, and different folks get it at different times and in different ways. That being said, your responsibility is to carry your drawings to a more sophisticated place where you can communicate more clearly those ideas that you do have that you want to express to us. It would have, even without a kind of clear overall idea, would have allowed you to much more credibly have us listen to your ideas regarding the plan relationships of the elements you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Max, do you have any final comment on?
I agree and understand everything which the reviewers have said. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, so I think it is pretty clear that the use of solid colors and collages with no further kind of meaning of texture and rendering and everything makes makes it difficult to really the atmosphere of the place. But anyways,
Yeah.
I think it's time to move on. Thank you, Max.
Our T model. Our T model.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm assuming I'm next.
Eddie?
Yeah, I'm assuming I'm next.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna share my screen.
Eddie, can you increase the volume a little?
I'll have my mic up closer. I think this is the maximum I could do.
Okay, that's fine. I can do it on my end too.
Oh, all right, perfect. Okay.
You go by Eddie?
Yeah, I go by Eddie.
Awesome.
I'm sorry, my display is a little weird, so it's refusing to let me go into full video mode. So okay. All right.
We can see it on the Miro.
Oh, I created a short PowerPoint to explain the general idea. So I guess I'll just start. So for this project, so before I kind of dive into explaining the little details of all the concepts, the general concept of the, I guess, the hostel design is creating a separation between the hostel, which is considered the private, and the public, which is considered to be the courtyard. But at the same time, I'm utilizing the separation between these two spaces simultaneously to act as a bridge to connect the two separate zones. So generally, all the spaces are internalized within the private mass. So as seen in the kind of like the roof plan, the right side of the kind of like the curvature wall mass is where the private space is, and the left side where the shell is considered to be the public. So the division between the spaces are internalized with the private mass, and the existing shell, I guess the separation is kind of reinforced through the height, and creating a sense of privateness with the new pedestrian street, which is created between the shell and the mass. It's kind of acting as a gateway for the hostel user and the community to come together in the kind of the central area, which is located within the shell. So as seen in the plans, all the private and the semi-private spaces are located in the right side of the mass, with the exception of the second floor, which is connected into the shell and the private mass. And I did this because the semi-private spaces are, even though it's still considered private, it still breaks the rule of being completely private. So by the, I guess, the sense of private, semi-privateness, I felt it was acceptable to put it within the shell where all the public spaces are located. And all the private spaces, which are the rooms, are positioned along the edges of the building on the right side to allow maximum natural light to enter. And the first floor, which is also considered a semi-private space where the gaming rooms are, the laundry, all the other kind of like the remaining spaces, has generally on the facade generally have a different, I guess, window layout compared to the upper two floors, which are considered to be the private spaces. So I guess the Rider party diagram shows that the shell, which is the existing, against the new or with the private space, kind of represented as a darker wood. And for the material, I'm utilizing the contrast between the dark wood and the lighter oak wood. And it's generally like the larger picture is symbolizing rather where the darker wood represents the privateness and the lighter wood is symbolizing the sense of public. And that's also conveyed within the room as well. And I realized that the party diagram on the left is misrepresented in terms of the color scheme, where the kind of like the bed framing is lighter, but it should be the other way around. I realized that mistake a little late. So I guess the two renders on the right side actually represent the room, like the idea behind the room more accurately. So the rooms are divided into 2 beds and the 4 beds with the dark wood framing each beds, and the space is able to be divided into 2. like, so even in one room, it's divided into 2 floors due to the height of the ceiling, which is approximately 12 to 13 foot. And I've seen in kind of like these section perspective and the kind of like the new pedestrian street render, the bike rental area is positioned towards the entrance of the kind of like the new pedestrian street that I've created. And this is, by doing so, I'm able to reduce the kind of the collision between just the normal pedestrians and the bike users. And also with the bike rental space kind of connected into the courtyard, it allows even with people who are not technically the hostel users to, when they enter to rent a bike or store the bike, it's giving them the choice to come into the space. And I guess that pretty much sums up the kind of like the overview of how I laid out my project.
So I would say I appreciate being a rationalist myself, having come from an engineering background. I appreciate your sort of rationalist perspective. You think didactically and in terms of systems. First A, then B, private, not private. This has formed a strong kind of organizing concept for you to create a kind of larger narrative for addressing the site. And it works in your favor. The good news for you is in the future, you'll be able to take these didactic, very clear ideas that you have and be able to relax them a little bit as you become more sophisticated with systems and allow a little bit of A in your B, a little bit of B in your A, a little bit of your first floor and your second floor, a little bit of your private and your public and private. But this is a clear way to think about and organize your thoughts. That was the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say was that when I first heard you present your ideas, you're taking a very secure existing brick structure that you would think would lend itself very well to having a private function. And then you're creating this new thing on the outside and putting all the private stuff out there. And as I was first thinking about that, I was thinking, well, that's a little bit bizarre. Why would you do that? And then it occurred to me that I think it's possible that you would think of this existing brick shell with its history as being part of the community and with its beauty and spatial quality as something that you wanted to give back to the community and open up. So I appreciate the thought that you've created this new private volume on the outside and that you've basically opened up the existing brick structure as much as possible. And I appreciate that you've actually expressed the material quality of the brick. I think it's the first time I've seen that. Now, all of that being said, the quality of this existing, this new private volume on the outside, I'm critical of the massing and the connection to the community. I think it reads as very heavy, and it's hard for me really to understand the relationship of that building to the community, even as I do appreciate the courtyard that you've created between the existing brick and the new. So I think if I were to focus in pushing this project forward in the future, I would focus on the material expression of this building on the outside, the way the windows work, and its material quality.
I see.
I come from a similar sort of rationalist point of view, and I can appreciate breaking down all of the components of a program, of a project, of a set of systems. You know, I had a very similar thought in terms of the idea to make this private space outside of the bunker-like space that you were already given, and actually the maybe he gave you a save in terms of the giving it back to the community. I think it's a reasonable sort of out to that what is otherwise
troubling.
Yeah, troubling or contradicting to what's actually existing there.
I see.
And I think you could spend time to argue the merits of both, and both versions of them could have a successful execution and dialogue. I really do appreciate the sort of organized nature, even of just the presentation, to see that there's an idea, and I'm breaking it down in pieces so you can understand, the point of view, and then I build it back up with maybe some of the drawings and the models. What's sort of refreshing about the presentation too is that there's a range of thoughts, and they're all sort of equally brought up at sort of an equal level in terms of I am taking into context a structural thought. I am taking into context a material thought. I am taking into context sort of the direct contact with two different materials and the experience that they will be. I'm taking into context this idea of entering the space and having this collision between the public and the private, and even in terms of using physical models, sort of what look to be like sort of sketch renderings and computer renderings and collage and all of those different medias, I think is a strong way to approach a design project. I think the space in between the two, that there's this one rendering down here with the space in between the two. I enjoy that. I enjoy the idea of having sort of a separation that's an actual separation, and what the space can become in between the two spaces, especially if you draw a line between public and private. That interstitial space is really it's a critical part of architecture in terms of when you step off the street into a building. And I think that there's something there, you could develop that. But even to be able to see that if I'm standing there, what the materials are, it allows somebody to make a judgment as to whether they agree with the material choices or not. Similarity, with the woods, by making that statement, by actually explaining to somebody that there is an idea between the two types of woods and the relationships, it allows you to have a dialogue. So it says a lot in terms of thinking on multiple layers, which is ultimately what we wind up doing in the profession.
Thank you.
I enjoy the fact that there's a lot of different things going on, and that any one of these little vignettes we could have sort of a breakout discussion on, in terms of taking those ideas to another level. I guess that's where.
Mark, I agree with your thoughts about the strengths of this project. I want to take one of the things I was talking about earlier, and that is having fully agreeing with your thoughts, Mark. Talking about the material quality of this volume on the outside for a minute. The architecture of the brick on the left of this center rendering is strong and heavy and massive. I personally, the reason I think you would go with wood architecture on the right is to contrast, right? To do something that would be light and non-load bearing. Maybe a timber frame structure, or maybe wood siding over a steel facade. But instead, as you look at this center rendering, and indeed the perspective model that you've done on the right, you can see you've treated the wood walls as though they were load bearing by making the walls very, very thick, and by creating what are called punched openings. Do you know what a punched opening is? It's when you take a load-bearing structure and you actually put holes in it. Paradoxically, creating those openings makes the structure seem even heavier.
I see.
I would study what creating a non-load-bearing structure would do. And that would allow you to much more flexibly create openings that would create a new architecture that would be lighter. And that lightness
I see.
would create a stronger connection to the community. You know what I'm attracted to is the axonometric in the middle that shows both the old and the new, that has on the left here, just underneath your massing model. You see that small axonometric drawing? No, that's not the one. Zoom out.
Which?
Keep zooming. Yeah.
Which one?
Right. Move your mouse down, 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 and to the left, just a tiny bit. Up, 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 up. Axonometric. There's some transparency in that drawing. You're not going there, but there's some there it is. Yes, there's some transparency in that circulation diagram that actually, for me, is a more attractive expression of your building than this thick-walled, postmodern masonry large structure that you've shown that is so heavy. There's something light and floating about it. I like the way it contrasts with the existing brick. I like the way you understand this object within an object in this axonometric drawing. None of those things are actually visible in real life at all. And it would be nice if you, as you develop the building, began to reveal these elements of the building. So, and then as well, to think very carefully regarding the connection of this building to the surrounding community and to the surrounding buildings of the community, so that you begin to develop a kind of contextual relationship, either in opposition to or in agreement with the surrounding buildings. And then with your landscaping on the outside and site features back to the building. None of that has been thought about at all. And this is where I would go if I were to continue to develop your project.
I see.
I'm curious, is there a height restriction at all in the neighborhood?
I'm actually not sure about that. That was the one area that I haven't actually carefully looked at.
That's a really important one to find out when you start, because it seems like you've gone an entire story above at least all the other ones, whether by default or by zoning resolution, whatever. They have not gone above the existing structure by that much. You have a full story above them, which I think it reinforces what Eric was saying, that it's sort of this big solid thing outside next to this other solid thing. It sort of creates a wall to the community. And if you're going to do that, you have to be really careful about how you express that 3-story space next to what looks like an existing 2-story space.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where the idea of kind of portraying that big mass more lighter may also, I guess, come into aid in terms of kind of communicating that kind of language to the neighborhood as well.
Yeah, I agree. You've actually created in your structure diagram this idea of what would presumably be a non-load bearing building. Yet your
I actually
doesn't
looked
express
into
that at all.
Yeah, I looked into kind of like combining the steel, kind of like having the kind of like basically the primary be the steel and like a combination of kind of like the wood cladding as well, kind of to make it lighter. But I guess when I was kind of portraying that into the exterior, I guess that's where I fell short.
Yeah, it's true. You don't really have the knowledge of different kinds of architecture to be able to portray the sort of structural diagram that you've actually created. I think the structure diagram seems about right, if a bit static, perhaps.
Mhm. Mhm.
I wouldn't advise you to take the structure diagram, have it be the basis of your project, and then just decorate the structure. That would be
Definitely.
overly deterministic. On the other
Mhm.
hand, the idea of having some kind of structural grid that you could deform and break in response to this sort of non-load bearing shell of wood that would be
Mhm.
much more transparent would give you the opportunity, because of the strength of what looks like to be steel construction here, to create much more openness and connection, even between your private areas and the outside. It's possible
I
to
see.
preserve privacy and yet still create the appearance of openness, but it's a tricky game.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So, Eddie, with you, we close the first part of the morning review. To
Mhm.
me, as a general comment, I really appreciate the sense of materiality that you have
Mhm.
in the project. Kind of leaving behind my personal opinion about which material fits better or not. I
Yeah.
appreciate that the board at least conveys information about that. And out of
Thank
this
you.
morning session, I think has been the most the best example that represents materiality. Also, I appreciate the clarity of the presentation with your PowerPoint. So that I agree with Eric that this methodic way of thinking about a project kind of goes in your favor. But yeah,
Thank
I
you.
think, Jen, you have any other comments? Shall we close this first part of the morning session here?
No, I don't have any other comments right now, but yeah, we could go ahead and close it. I think that the intent was to have a few-minute break before the next session. And I know, Manuel, some of the instructors are swapping. My
Yeah.
studio is staying in this breakout session. So
I'm the only one leaving, right?
yeah, so I think, yeah, other than
Oh,
so should I leave too, and my students as well, who are still here? Nick and okay, okay.
So
Oh,
we should push the button that says leave breakout room.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, thanks. Good critting with you.
thanks, Eric.
I think he left already.
Oh well.
So Jeremy, should we start maybe in 10 minutes? 5 minutes?
Okay. Sure.
Time for coffee. Ben, you want coffee?
Thomas. Also, don't say experiential experiences.
Did I say that?
Calling you out.
Oops.
Hey, Jeremy. It seems like Manuel got assigned to breakout room 2, but I thought Nathan was. I'll go back in now. I just wanted to ask. There you go. So, Nathan, are you listening? Okay. From my, I see, yeah. Right. Yeah, we could go ahead and start. I just wanted to make sure Nathan was ready. Nathan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great. Yeah, so Katya is first up. Katya, you ready?
Yeah, should I go ahead and start?
Yeah, you can go ahead and start. I'll get the timer going. Go ahead.
Can you all see and hear everything okay?
Yep. Yep, we're
Great.
set.
My name is Katya, and my overall concept for the Spring Garden Hostel is focusing on bringing in visitors to Pittsburgh and members of the surrounding community, both to this hostel space. So I want to do that by providing opportunities for events, public gathering spaces that the neighborhood doesn't currently have. So the overall concept is a series of stacking volumes which allow for various levels of privacy as a visitor moves up into the building. So the darkest gray here would be the most private space and the lighter would be the least private. So you can see kind of as you were to move through the building, you'd enter the more private spaces as you move up. Each level seen in the plans here build in level of privacy. At the ground level, there's a reception area as you enter here, as well as kind of a shared eating space. In this smaller volume, there's a public cafe. And then as you move up through the space, there's library, game room, and finally in the third volume, again, the most private represented by the darker gray is the sleeping areas. So the entry conditions shown here are key to the experience of the hostel. The 2 courtyard spaces that I included are intended to invite visitors and Pittsburgh residents to spend their time here. So the top image is the plaza space right on the corner of the intersection that visitors encounter when walking up to the hostel. So it's left largely open to allow some breathing room for people who are walking in from these surrounding tight sidewalks. And the interior courtyard, shown kind of at the entry here on the bottom, is a place to stay and feel a level of safety and enclosure for guests while remaining outside. So this interior courtyard is also shown here in the center of this section perspective. And this, I think, really shows the relationship of the existing brick shell to the hostel. So I decided to kind of detach all of the volumes from the existing brick shell and instead embrace this idea of kind of being inside and outside at the same time when inside this interior courtyard. So this space acts as kind of central to the hostel. There's the other volumes are crowded around it, and it is a nice gathering area. The contrast of the inside and outside the shell also continues in the placement of the building volumes, as you can see here. So rather than tucking away the private spaces within the shell and leaving the public spaces outside it, the roles of these spaces are flipped. The public is the large volume here, which actually rises above the shell and outside it to bring the visitors more into the community rather than hiding all of the private spaces inside the shell and not allowing the community to access them. So the sleeping spaces themselves were designed to provide each guest with natural light, though they're in tight quarters. There's the issue of designing for many beds in a small space, but the way that I approached this was by placing a corridor into the long volume here. Then placing beds above the corridor, light is able to circulate throughout the private and public spaces. And I'm just going to switch to Miro so that we can continue our discussion here.
Katya, you're done with your comments, right?
Mm-hmm. Can you all see the Miro board? Okay.
Yeah.
We can hit. Katya, I think it's interesting how you switch the relationship of the kind of private component and the more public component, and put the public on the inside and the private is kind of arching over the public spaces. That's an interesting experiment to go through. Can you talk a little more about the relationship of your new volumes within the existing shell and kind of the how they're positioned with one another along the back and front wall?
Yeah, so I have kind of this, maybe I can show it here. I kind of have these 2 axes. So on one hand, you have kind of what is existing, the largest door hole in the existing wall which would have been assumed to have been the old entrance, is right here. So I thought I could use that to create an axis here, but also that is an entrance off of a very small sidewalk. So that left this opportunity for the plaza to kind of open up. So the idea is that these two axes are kind of intersecting, and it provides the opportunity to hopefully have this interior courtyard feel enclosed, but still have ways to open up to the community. And the idea is that the interior courtyard could be closed off at certain times of day, or if the hostel was closed, but that this plaza space would stay open and hopefully encourage this movement this way. In terms of the volumes, I definitely wanted to have kind of this arrangement of volumes where there was some contrast between this volume here in material as well as to accentuate what I've been talking about with the private and public kind of being separate, but of course you can move from one to the other. So that's why this larger volume kind of misaligns purposefully with the other volumes and bridges over it. Yeah, going across the two smaller volumes.
Did you have any thoughts on materiality of the new forms within the shell?
Yeah, I was thinking of the larger volume, the private one being concrete or potentially steel framed, something heavier, and then the other two being lighter. I really liked the contrast of the heavier volume kind of arching over. And the idea would be, obviously, you can see it's kind of rooted in the ground here, and it would also come on this other side. You can kind of see the jutting out here. So thinking about those smaller volumes being lighter, maybe a wood frame, or if not, at least a wood cladding would be interesting.
Yeah, I have a couple comments, and the first one is this idea of encouraging sort of a public and private interaction, and its relationship to to a hostile program. It's interesting because it actually does have a sort of natural generator for that kind of discussion, particularly in an area where you're trying to rebuild sort of an urban infrastructure, and where there may not be some other venues for those types of interaction. Particularly with a hostel, people who go to hostels are usually, they're travelers, they're museum goers, they're artists, and in this industrial sort of envelope, it lends itself to those kinds of public displays or venues, whether they be art installations or music, and your resolution or your identification of this center courtyard as a place where some of that could happen is it's an interesting idea. I think one thing that's come up on some of the other reviews, and I think it's easy to I guess to comment on or critique, is that in this one and in some of the other ones, the idea is to sort of put another box completely inside of an existing perfectly good and reactable box. So that's one comment that I would say is maybe a slight detriment to the plan, because you've done things in plan that allow you to have this sort of separate volume read inside the box, but what you've done is you've created a whole nother building inside of, you sort of abandoned the brick envelope and made a whole nother building, which inherently in itself would be difficult, costly, and you would question why you couldn't sort of integrate the two, or use the existing walls as a springboard for the same idea, and do something with that. So I would question if you could look at that. That would be something that would make the two smaller volumes inside. I think they would respond better to the site if they somehow played off of the existing structure somehow, or engaged, even if it was openings or views or structure pockets, things that were there, something that then allowed you to tie the two together. I agree that the idea of flipping the public and private is an interesting one, but in terms of a presentation, I don't know that it's clear to me why in this particular presentation what you gain from putting people up top. I think if that's a major move in a design idea, then you have to show why. Why would you go through such an effort to bring the public through what would potentially want to be a private area or a secured area? What benefit do you gain by bringing them through that space and creating this other platform? Is it a view? Is it something else? And then inherently in sort of programming those kinds of things, how is there a way that you could somehow still separate the two? So somebody who comes to a hostel and ultimately wants to feel safe, they're not sort of inundated by people walking by their rooms or whatever. Let's see.
Katya, do you want to speak to that or address that?
Yes. I'm really glad that you, thank you for the comments. I'm really glad you brought up the kind of conversation of inviting the community in. This was something that we talked about through the whole process of, I really have this goal of creating a space in the community now, which has been hard because there's not really anything to look to in this community as an example of what they would want. Would they want a space for live music? Things like that. And in my idea of this hostel, like you said, I think hostel goers are people who want to be social and want to, it's not staying in a hotel. You don't want to spend all your time in your room. You want to spend time in shared spaces. And usually the place you're traveling to truly experience it as authentically as possible. So this idea of kind of having a relationship where the people who are visiting and the people who are living in the neighborhood can get something from each other, or the experience of knowing each other is great. And I think also there's a lot of, it's a lot more complicated than that. And so certainly like the idea of bringing the private space in and above is something that I think is about views, is about letting the public spaces be inside the shell. Definitely could still be worked on, and I kind of wouldn't know if it would perform as I would hope that it would until it actually got people in there. But definitely my goal with that was to not just put, I don't think anyone's done this, but just put a hostel inside this shell that has no connection to the community around it. So yeah, that was kind of my goal there.
I do agree with Mark's comment about the kind of juxtaposition of the existing wall and the new volumes within, that I almost want to either pull them apart a little bit more so you can at least get some kind of visual connection within the new volumes and relationship to the existing wall, or pull them even farther so it's an actual occupiable space, just a little more relationship. I think the center courtyard is very effective. It's just the flanking walls of the existing and the new volumes along the east and west sides of the existing wall could be conjoined a little better.
Yeah, I think in terms of like other views or other things that could be explored, if this idea of the public sort of entering this space in addition to sort of hostile goers, what's the view looking at the entrance, or how do you find it? And then this is something we didn't talk about in the other reviews, but it certainly has a place. Is I think of a hostel as you're in the map, you have a map and the rain, and I know that it's now it's a phone and an Uber, but I think of what's the focus point of the entrance of a program like this, and some way you have to be able to find it. So I see the rendering with the with the old entrance there. And I wonder if there's anything that could be done to sort of highlight the existing structure in a way to suggest that this is an actual opening, particularly if it's on a narrow street. And I didn't realize that until you had mentioned that. I didn't kind of think about that, but if you're sort of redirecting traffic around the corner, then there's sort of a primary and a secondary entrance. Maybe this is an oculus and not an entrance, but you know, what are you doing then to encourage that natural flow into the space, into that courtyard, which is ultimately what you really want when you have a successful courtyard, is you want it to be sort of a natural entrance. So that might be one other view or something that you could look at, that you know, to reinforce those ideas.
Yeah, just to build on some of those comments a bit, I apologize. I missed the introduction. I was in the other breakout room or something, so I'm getting my bearings a little bit here. But I think that I do feel also that the entrances, really both of them, could be a little bit more prominent and a little bit more welcoming. They might be welcoming in different ways if they are meant to sort of service different communities. Or different types of occupants, but in order to sort of pull people off of the street, there might be something there. I think also the exterior, the sort of corner space, it seems like it's in a lot of projects today, it seems a little unresolved. I think that's the case here as well. I think that there is, it seems like there might be some programmatic intent, but it's still, I think that it's public spaces, open public spaces are really hard to design because we want to kind of leave them open and leave them flexible for different uses and different people, different types of people to come in and use them. But I think that especially as a sort of front porch, essentially to your building, it could do a lot more to sort of welcome the community and to also serve as a welcome mat, to sort of link that space to the interior courtyard space, or to the sort of interior programmatic elements, because right now it feels mostly like an open plaza. And people do use open plazas, but they tend to sit around the outside edges of them. Right, or walk through them. And it's really uncomfortable to walk through an open plaza because you just feel like you're out in the savannah and there's no protection around you. So I can see people kind of using that overhang space, especially Pittsburgh. We get a lot of precipitation of various kinds. That sort of nook underneath, especially if there was some exterior lighting and maybe some sort of material changes that are sort of encouraging the use of that space. But there's a lot of space that's unprotected and kind of unresolved in that exterior space.
Yeah, I question whether that the leg that comes down, it's right now it's not rendered. It's, you know, what is the material of that? How does it respond to the existing structure? And can it actually provide potentially some of those kind of scrim seating areas that essentially are what would activate an exterior courtyard, like Talia is saying.
Yeah, I should mention that back door you can see kind of here in the rendering is for the bike rental that is integrated into the hostel. So that's kind of hopefully drawing some people in that direction. But those are really helpful comments. I think, Talia, you weren't here, but what we were talking about earlier and probably what y'all had talked about as well is that courtyards are hard in Pittsburgh weather because you want kind of on good days to have somewhere to sit in the sun, but then you want somewhere to be if it's raining. And so kind of just hitting that balance, I think it's something that still needs to be worked through, of creating spaces that can hopefully be used at all time of year.
Thank you, Katya. I think we're at time, so we need to move on. But
thank you.
Thanks. So I think next up,
Susie's next.
Yeah. So I can share my screen. Yeah, so my name is Susie. So to begin, I want to start off with my kind of party slash massing strategy that explains my reaction to the existing shell as well as the given program. So to begin, I kind of wanted to push my mass off of the existing shell and open up one of the walls to create more interaction with the site and with people at large. So in turn, this kind of creates the presence of two courtyards, one that is an entry court and one that is a more private courtyard that is in part created by the existing brick wall that is in the back. Afterwards, I angled both of the legs of my mass to create a kind of pinching condition, both within this entry courtyard here, as well as creating a secondary entrance into the back private courtyard here. Then I split the levels and hinged one leg to establish a main mass for the hostel rooms. And lastly, extended that to kind of create an overhang within the back courtyard. So next, looking into the details of the plan. So within the first floor, I kind of hid the entry space on the back of one of the hinged legs. Afterwards, you enter into a lobby space. It's connected into a bike storage kind of service space with a back entrance. Next, you're kind of funneled in to this main space here that functions as both kind of a cafe as well as a seating space. So here, I kind of really wanted to create a transparent middle space that in a sense functions as a transient space in between both courtyards. So because of the presence of the glass on both sides, you're able to see through both of the spaces, as well as kind of see the existing pre-existing brick wall that was created. With the second floor, I kind of wanted to convey the idea of integrating blocks of private rooms with open interactive spaces with views into the courtyard. So these spaces here are spaces that face in towards the courtyard. And then here in a kind of opened hallway, kind of taking advantage of the natural shape that was created by the mass that I showed earlier, as well as the occupiable roof space. I wanted to create a kind of more interactive space on the second floor as well. So in section, I wanted to focus on two main things. The first being the kind of spaces that are created by the hinged masses, and the second being the transparency of the kind of middle space that's created by both of the glass that's on either side. So you can especially see that here in my sectional perspective. So here's the kind of private inner courtyard, as well as the entry court, as well as this kind of like permeable interior space that is established in the middle of them. And then this is just a viewpoint from the inside of that inner courtyard with the existing brick shell.
So we had talked about this with one of the other presentations too, that the idea of creating this volume that sort of breaks through the existing shell and sort of reaches out into the corner community space. And you know, this one, it's very clear in terms of the sort of volumetric and even some of the materials chosen. It's a much lighter intervention, even though you're breaking through sort of a heavy wall. And the first floor having that sort of light touch to the ground helps when you break through sort of a heavier volume like that. I think in terms of the corner, you touched on sort of engaging that corner and the entry space. I think I would want to see more of what's happening at that ground level, because it's so critical. How you actually enter the courtyard. You see once you're in there, but you're not seeing sort of the approach to it and how you see it from the street. I think I'd want to see something from the across the street or down the street, looking sort of towards it, because it seems like it does reference somewhat the axis of the longer street towards this. I think it's the south. Looks like it's the south, right? That's the other thing, is you should always have a north arrow so we know where the sun is. But yeah, it looks like it's the south is the larger street, right down the where the two streets come together.
Yeah.
When the volume is that big and it sort of breaks through the masonry, I would think I would want to see what it looks like from the street level across the street, or sort of pointing at it. Otherwise, I think that the spaces are the courtyard spaces it's successful in terms of sort of being its own thing inside of the volume of the brick. I think I would still question the amount of new interventions relative to whatever's already there. But if that was the design, it's clear that you're sort of touching lightly to the masonry structure, and sort of using it as a courtyard background, as opposed to some kind of a structure that you would then reference or use for the new project. So those are my comments.
I think when I look at the 2D section, Susie, I think that I appreciate this sort of subtle opening up of the kind of, I don't know, it's, I guess it's a little bit of a cantilever, the cantilevering volume that's sitting on top. I think that it could be stronger as, right now it's sort of in between feeling as a sort of celebratory projection of this, this heroic volume that's sitting on top, and being sort of nestled within other volumes, because of the way that the L is sort of biting into it a little bit. It's like I either want that L to be a little bit more subtle and a little less read a little bit less like a volume, and maybe be a little squatter, a little lower, and so that it's a little bit more impactful. Not even necessarily on the interior. It's sort of hard for me to tell what it's like moving from the one axis to the other axis when you're in that sort of hallway space, because it seems to get narrow and tight again in plan anyway. But I think that on the exterior, just the sort of compositionally, the play of volumes reads a little bit awkward at that particular moment when the two are coming together. I think also, I appreciate the sort of nesting of these things within the kind of arm of the existing brick structure. I wish that the sort of material abutment of the new versus the old were a little bit more resolved, because it also feels like it's just not sure what it wants to be yet, whether that is a very light touch of just primarily glass that is just sort of abutting but not necessarily reading as a volume going through, whereas at other moments it sort of reads as if it is this volume. So there's a sort of, it's potentially interesting, but I don't think that the ambiguity is intentional. And I think that it sort of leaves things up for interpretation that I think that you have intentions about, but haven't quite resolved yet.
Mm-hmm.
Susie, I think that there's a lot that you're doing that is starting to really work and make sense. I think that probably the bigger critique is where you stopped and what that I feel like the the conditions are laid to be able to move the project forward in a number of ways. For instance, this move where you're choosing to shift the volume that extends into the kind of public space, the existing public space. I wonder if, and I like the way that you're starting to take advantage of that with an occupiable space on the second floor, but it seems like that the opportunity would be to, even if it's more subtle in other areas, to not have that be a singular moment, but to perhaps extend the upper level to create an overhang on the ground floor and a couple spots that might support perhaps the, flank the courtyard space to create a little space where people could linger outside and not get wet, or something along those lines. I also think that it's telling that, in the ground floor plan, that the exterior space itself, not the inner courtyard, but the entrance courtyard, has no sense of activity or use or vegetation imbued in it. So it's primed to have that layer of information added. So I think that I would just want to encourage you to keep, kind of at least mentally, keep developing and extending your ideas, because I think that it would really allow you to kind of realize the full potential of the scheme.
I had one comment, Susie, just kind of building off what Jen said about kind of the articulation of the courtyards. While I really appreciate kind of that secondary entrance where you have this kind of compressive space that you're opening out into that larger courtyard space, I feel as if it's less orchestrated, and I wish you could kind of lead the user kind of into that moment more not forcefully, but kind of more of a kind of intentional move, so that they can kind of find that along their kind of circuitous path through the building.
Susie, are there any aspects of the scheme that haven't been commented on yet that you have, you'd like some feedback on?
I don't think so. I guess one thing that I would like to talk about was a point that was brought up about the entries into the courtyards, which I realized I hadn't touched much upon. So into the back courtyard, I never intended for this space, this kind of space that's created by the hinged mass, to be a primary entrance. I actually intended for the primary entrance into the back courtyard to be these two glass doors that are placed at the end of this kind of transient space here. And then this kind of, in a sense, to be discovered by someone who was on the inside of the space rather than on the outside coming in. So I guess if that changes any of the comments that were made, then I think, yeah, that's about it.
Not being super familiar with this particular intersection in this neighborhood, it's hard for me to speculate, but I would imagine that a significant amount of the traffic is coming from the intersection, in which case that's why I personally would read it as not necessarily the primary entrance, but as a clear entrance because of the way that the volume is composed with that wall. It's sort of it's a slip, but it's an inviting slip. If it were faced in the other direction, then I would maybe buy that as a more private discovery as opposed to an intentional entryway.
I think one of the only other comments might be is that there wasn't too much discussion about the actual experience of the the main notion of the hospital, which is the sort of cell that they live in or they spend the night in. And I think they're probably, I'm sure you have ideas about that, and it might not be a bad idea to see some version of how you intend to actually house the people that are there, because there's a lot of thought about the public space. The question is how does that manifest itself in also these private spaces as well, which is a major component of the program. So that might be some other small vignette or something. I see that, in terms of the presentation, there's a lot of space where you can actually use for additional information. Even it looks like on the 4 drawings on the side there, the diagrams, there's even a double one there. I'm not seeing that there's a difference between the 2 bottom ones. But just in terms of conveying the entire idea, if there was other pieces that you could put in here that might touch on how you're treating the cells or the rooms, something that's happening on the upper portion there in the actual circulation space. That might be another avenue to look at.
Okay, so we're pretty much at time. Unless there's any quick last comment, we can move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Susie.
All right, Carson, you're up next.
Okay. Awesome. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Good. Okay. So I wanted to start with a couple of pictures of the neighborhood, which I'm sure you guys are pretty familiar with by now. But I thought it was important to think about this hostel in its context a little bit more. This is a place that's pretty reluctant to change and sort of surrounded by a lot of houses that are 2 to 3 stories high, a lot of them really old, and in a place where there's almost no new construction, and certainly no nearby hotels. So I think it became important to me to preserve a lot of the character of the current site, as well as to not create a building over the top of the shell that dominates the area. I really want to take away from that and try to impose my own idea very aggressively throughout the neighborhood. So I chose to leave the majority of the brick shell in place, and the building is certainly no taller than what's already there. So I think that helped a lot to help it fit in. So I tried to think of the brick wall as more of a volume than a surface. So it sort of happened here on the right. Originally thinking about these sort of openings in the original facade, and thinking of them as more of a volume that could then be subtracted from the cut, and from there, that could sort of be, which is a sort of room that's cut out from the window in the old facade. So a bed and a space that occupies that old larger arch. So inside the rooms here, of course, and I think this helps to create a space with character that really relates back to what was originally there. Of course, all the rooms could not fit there, so I had to sort of extrapolate that logic into something new. And so, sort of the new addition to the south of the old shell, and this is something where instead of that repetition of the original facade, organizing the rooms, it could become sort of the opposite, in which the rooms were packed much more and a lot more efficient in terms of space. But the facade was then able to sort of reflect those changes, which isn't to say that they were sort of unrelated to anything. I think that the idea here is that you might have a sort of concrete exterior, which might be paneled or gridded, to which these arches themselves didn't fit. So much more of a composition, I think, in a menagerie towards the end, where there are these sort of brick arches punching through the concrete exterior, holding these glass windows in place. And so I think that moving to sort of talking about the public space here, the public space itself occupies the ground floor of the original footprint of the brick wall. And with that sort of courtyard placed in the middle, it helps to keep the space open, but break it up into different areas. And so certainly much more private areas, but then spaces where they can still be loud, but not heard everywhere, which I think is important in a hostel, as well as to be able to sort of keep the scale of the public space a lot larger and more characteristic of the original condition by sort of sticking it next to what was already there. So yeah, we've got the public space, and then wrapping around that all those bedrooms. So yeah, that's sort of there. I've got you can see here the perspective looking sort of down into the courtyard and the public space, and a section perspective here, which sort of shows the room sort of as an extrusion of that original arch, as well as the different scales of these public spaces and their relationships with the courtyard.
Is the intention for a brick structure?
With this sort of interior volume I have held up by some steel columns and beams, but I think a lot of this would end up being brick.
Carson, one of the things that I sort of question in looking, especially at this section that you were just zoomed in on, is this sort of poché space, which, you know, you're not designing HVAC systems or anything yet, but there is a significant amount of poché space, and I could imagine that that might actually not be full of solid volume brick, but might be more utilitarian. I do sort of question the roofscape as a missed opportunity for you, in part because you are trying to maybe acknowledge some of the surrounding urban fabric of the neighborhood, which, as you mentioned, is a little bit more residential in scale, is primarily older construction, a lot of masonry and a lot of wood, but there might be a way through this sort of sculpting of the roofscape to also maybe start to break down the scale of the building a bit more, or read it in a slightly different way. I also think that in the incorporation, I like that this sort of slippery game that you're playing of like not necessarily indicating what was the existing structure versus the new, with the sort of uniform materiality of the brick, but also sort of starting to integrate maybe some steel and some glass. I do think that I would have liked to see a bit more, maybe it's more just representationally. It's hard to say how much has been like where your design focus has been, but I think seeing a little bit more of sort of tectonic articulation, like around those windows, it seems like that's a detail that you've spent some time on, but I'm not really seeing very much about it here. And similarly, where the sort of glass face meets the brick face, is that flush on the exterior for a particular reason, or is there some reveal, right? So really starting to think about how these, because material is so important to your project, thinking about how the different materials start to come together. All these sort of edges and overlaps and like construction belly buttons of the building are where a lot of richness can live. And I think that that's something that I would I would push you a little bit more on.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I can just, my first thoughts are I can appreciate sort of the initial, even in the presentation, the initial investigation and sort of history of the neighborhood and how that plays into your thinking about what the intervention is. I guess one thing comes to mind, and we say this often to clients when we're trying to push maybe a little bit more progressive idea than they're willing to tolerate, is that contextualism does not mean mimicry. And there's a important line that you have to sort of draw in terms of how you approach a contextual response. And I think it sort of goes a little bit to what Talia is saying about the idea of the separation between the old and the new, whether you blur it completely and you mimic through representation of the old, or whether you try to make an intervention that then complements and extends the life of an older building. I think in terms of the initial diagrams, I particularly am relatively deterministic in terms of the way that I approach a site. I look at those kind of relationships like you did with the windows, where you sort of extruded the volume of the site of the window. Looking at other buildings to see what viewpoints are present and what paths. I think those are important tools when doing an initial investigation of a site, and I think that's something that is clear, is sort of in your mindset about representing the site in terms of the givens and sort of playing off of them. But I think it's only the beginning. Ultimately, what you do with those givens is ultimately what somebody's going to ask you to do with it, right? And when I see you're talking about sort of the heavy masonry, and I see the exterior concrete wall, I question why there's arches in a concrete wall when the windows are only 10 feet wide, right? So arches are arches because bricks can't go 10 feet. Concrete can go, for the most part, limitless, depending on how you structure it, right? So if you're talking about materiality, can you represent the materials that you're using in a true fashion? I would question arches, the arches, sort of new arches, but I would question, is it realistic to think that a hostel would build a masonry load-bearing structure? It's probably a little romantic to think that would be the resolution. But if you're going to go that far, if you're going to try to represent this as if it was no different than it's the same structure as it was built 100 years ago, I think there's probably some gaps in the sort of formal representation of those brick openings and how you, again, this is just talking about it from a materiality point of view. I think that like I see the one rendering on the brick beds, and it's a little disturbing to me, and it's just because I understand what the intent is to represent that you're in an industrial building and you're being true to the nature of the space, but the thought of sleeping in a brick pizza oven doesn't really seem like that's a place where I want to be. And again, I think the ideas are there. I just think the representation of it maybe needs to be looked at. You're showing a steel beam there, and then you show the brick arch, and you just kind of question why one or the other, and how it's resolved. I think from a presentation point of view, if if you have in your head this materiality, you have to present materiality in a way where you can sort of you can almost touch it in the way that you're representing it. And I think with the flatline drawings, even with the fill in the hatch, it's hard to understand that you're thinking about material when you don't see any of the materials. And again, that's just from a presentation point of view. You have to use the tools that reinforce the ideas that you have in the best way you can. And I think you have the idea about this sense of materiality. It's just it's not showing through unless I heard you speak about it. So that's my comment.
To add to that very quickly, Carson, I think, brick as you've represented it here feels very generic, but brick is such a tactile material. And I think if you, once we're allowed back on campus, I think if you, even just walking around Carnegie Mellon's campus, brick is used in many, many different ways. Sure. And its interaction with other materials in the buildings are, used in very different ways. It becomes sort of ornamental in some places, it becomes structural in some places, it reinforces the structural in some places, it sort of masks the structural in other places, it reads as volume, it reads as screen, right? So all of these things can be done, and I think it's sort of what makes masonry to me a really fascinating material, or family of materials really. But I agree. I think right now it's just sort of reading as block, and it's missing that tactility, and that's really what it's about, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Mark, it's funny, your comment about the pizza oven, I had the exact same thought, but I think
it's almost lunchtime.
Yeah, I know. Although I love the idea that maybe bread would come out of that little opening in the morning for you. But I think it's part of what's interesting, Carson, is you started with a very sensitive reading of the site, and I was going along with you in terms of how you were thinking about the reality of the site. But what seems like to me in a kind of interesting / semi-perverse way is that you've created almost an entirely new narrative or fiction to what this existing building might have been. Mm-hmm. Like if this had been the site of a former bakery, maybe there would have been a way to kind of make a more direct connection between that reference of the space that you've created. When I first saw like these small pod-like sleeping room cabins that you've created, I started thinking of the whole Japanese pod or Asian pod hotel model, where people can, enter into their own individual sleeping space, but then otherwise, once they emerge, they're in a very shared type of collective space. And I was a little surprised. It took me quite a bit to work through your plans and try to decipher what was happening. But I think that it almost suggested a very different type of hostel than what you ended up designing in a way. And so I got a little bit lost in the kind of original narrative that you started with and where you ended up. But anyway, and I agree with a lot of the comments about the materiality and ultimately how that reads. But I just wonder if somewhere in the middle of that process for you, there was a moment where you defaulted to kind of creating a normative type of organization that perhaps is different than where you started for the sleeping rooms in particular.
Yeah, the sleeping room actually, when I see a brick sleeping room, I think of a hostel where you're being incarcerated.
I was thinking more like monastic cells personally, but I do agree that the sort of organizational structure of the thing maybe doesn't quite match the spatial qualities that you seem to be interested in.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the last minute, so if there's any last comments, or Carson, you had anything you wanted folks to comment on that they haven't already?
I think that's pretty much it. I just say, like, in terms of like workflow, I think there definitely was, even in terms of my thinking, like a disconnect. Once I sort of had that original conception of the idea after we visited the site, and then sort of after spring break, kind of came home, and I think I sort of got caught up in something new instead of sort of extending that old narrative. So certainly would love to go back and sort of change the process there in the middle. But yeah, that's sort of about it.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Carson.
Thank you.
And Franklin's next.
Hello, my name is Franklin. I'm going to share my screen. Right. So my decision to preserve the shell's original footprint is based on a quote by Raphael Monet that says that the preservation of a site artifact is a tribute to its own integrity. So by creating a gap between the existing brick shell with the hostel, it not only respects the existing shell as a site artifact, but also allows sufficient light to enter each room, and the exposure of the brick facade is what draws the residents into the individual room, at the same time also drawing them deep into the hostel space. So this also aligns to why my design derived from exploration through the section. And so in doing so, I create a series of light walls that not only shape the way light enters the space, but also begins to organize interior space. And the curve of the roof formed by these light walls is experienced in section in contrast to the ortho walls in plan. And the typology of a hostel allows one to move from the collective to the individual, and the orientation of the light wall aligns to this, with the east sun entering the light wall, creating harsh directional light, guiding the residents deep into the hostel, while the radiance of the space changes as the west sun enters the west light wall, creating a mysterious red glow from a glass plane on that light wall, drawing people up through the private staircase that leads to the private rooms directly underneath, thus creating during the evening. And the light walls essentially activates the sectional sequence, offering views to the visitors and the users of the hostel, offering views to the site in a variety of scale. So each one offers either a view to the neighborhood or the adjacent houses. And lastly, on the most upper one, looking outwards into downtown Pittsburgh. So in the exploration section, also emphasize the curved form of the roof, not only as treating as a volumetric element and not just as a cap on four walls. In doing so, the roof planes pose spaces over walls by using the soft light that hugs the curve of the roof, entering the private space, allowing phenomenal transparency, blurring the public and private. So this can be seen in the section where in the south sun, the soft light guides into the room, in the private room, while the public space is here. So creating a connection between two spaces.
Super quick comment for you, Franklin, and any other students who are maybe listening right now. I think that one of the difficulties with this format for presentation is just sometimes it's hard for us to orient ourselves. I think for everyone, I would err more on the side of notation, labels, titles for drawings, something to help us sort of connect the pieces to what you're saying, what you're talking about in your sort of narration, and what we're seeing on the board. Just because your drawings are really clear, and I really appreciate that, and I'm starting to piece things together, but it's going to take me a second to quite match what you're saying and what I'm seeing here, in part because hard for me to orient myself in these drawings.
Yeah, I had the same comment. It just, you know, there's a lot of shapes going on, and knowing where those shapes are in plan and section, I think would be very helpful. I agree that some form of notation, if this is truly a presentation board or something that would have to stand on its own, it would be helpful. Just so we know, is the assumption that which section is which?
So the long section is this way with the entrance to the hostel here. So the entrance is marked by this cantilever that frames the space by lifting the one side of the existing facade up, framing a new entrance, and that, yeah, so that creates a dynamic new entrance. So in the plan, you enter through here with the stairs on this gap.
Franklin, you started with that quote of Rafael Moneo, and I'm wondering, even at the risk of repeating yourself, if you could just connect the dots to say how you feel that you are developing that idea in your project.
Yeah, so his quote was about kind of preserving the site artifact, and the way I interpreted it was, in doing so, I peel away from the wall by creating these gaps that allow in light into the individual rooms, but the users of the hostel can perceive this gap as it opens up to the sky. And that's what encouraged me to explore through the section instead of the plan, instead of breaking out from the shell. But instead of just leaving this curbside alone, I took the opportunity to kind of still engage with the shell with the public, and that there's a series of threshold spaces like steps ups that are proportionally related to the interior, but also it kind of it's flush with the elevation change on the inside, so it kind of creates this transparency that you're in the outside space, you kind of can perceive that it draws you inside. So that's a way as a way for the public to engage with the shell. But then on inside, the shell is also concealed in a way by the new walls but in each individual room at the door entrance, a piece of the brick facade is revealed that pulls you into the space.
Am I correct in reading the drawing that the north wall is demolished?
The north wall is not demolished. I took essentially to create this space. I guess it is demolished in a sense because I took it down, but I was using the brick. And
that's the definition of demolished.
Yeah, yeah.
So okay. So the premise is that you preserve, but the first move is that you take down the wall.
Yeah, to mark like a new entrance. So that was the payoff of that. And I rearranged the brick to create this second
reusing the material.
Yeah, in a new way, in contrast to the neighborhood, so that this wall has porosity and staggers the brick to offer at night when the glow from the interior emits out, so the light activates this wall. So it's like using the old brick, but a new way in relation to the site.
So I'd like to just question that one notion and then the section. When I look at the long section in the middle of the page, it looks to me as if you have a beam structure running the short direction, and then a girder structure on top of it it's providing the cantilever. I just say that this is just something I understand that's probably not resolved, but in terms of your initial statement and then the first move, I would sort of question that cantilever and what you've done with it in terms of just resolving it. It looks the opposite. Normally the girders are below, the cantilevers below, and the beams are in between that, but it's the opposite, right? So just from a sort of a tectonic point of view, you've made a giant move by removing that wall, and then you've created a much bigger issue by putting the cantilever and then putting pieces of that wall above it. And I would just question where, where at that cost, what's the ultimate cost to the project? I can appreciate the idea of this in the back. When you look at the back section, this sort of peeling away, and the little light well that comes from sort of rounding off the brick and making it look like sort of an unresolved arch, and what happens with the brick, and those kinds of interventions, I think are they're exciting and they're sort of legitimate in the context of an older building. I think when you make a move like taking down the facade of a building and then recreating a facade, but on the premise of somehow preserving, I think there's a problem there. I think you have to, then if you're going to do that, it has to be very structured in terms of why you take down certain pieces and what the ultimate idea of reintroducing them in is, and the cost, so that the design cost and ultimately the financial cost. There's a lot of I appreciate the idea, and you're actually the only person who's spoken about the various coordinate points or the compass points and the types of light that come into the space. And ultimately, I think in general, all architects will say, light and shadow and how you create those spaces. I would challenge you to say the amount of effort put into bringing light into a space that I believe programmatically would probably only be used in the evening. Again, there's a design cost to that, and there's a financial cost to that. So I would question the premise of the building being these light wells in a program where most people are probably out seeing the city during the day, and they only get a glimpse of it. It's not to say that you don't introduce light and shadow. It's just if it's the prominence of the design, it sort of questions the programmatic and the sort of human in response to that design. But I when I see that when you're talking about the light coming in, and I see the back wall there sort of peeling away in one spot and the light coming in there, it's interesting. I wish I saw a section through that to see how you actually planned on doing that. If it was going to be with brick, or whether it would obviously have to be some kind of a steel frame holding a brick portion that peeled away from the building. And then when you look up above, I'm seeing it as a black line that's cobbled, I'm assuming representing the brick, and then a new straight wall above it. I wonder materially what's happening there. What's the connection between that old and new wall, if the premise is to preserve and then sort of expand on what's there. Those are the kinds of questions when, listening to what you're saying and then seeing the presentation, those are the kinds of questions that come up in my mind.
I would agree with those comments. I think that the sort of justification for these daylit spaces could potentially be programmatic if the impetus was to bring in, say, the community more for more public spaces during the day. I think we've seen things like that in a couple of these projects. You could also look at how this building acts as a sort of beacon at night, perhaps. There's some interior lighting scheme that sort of counterbalances the daylighting scheme. So these openings might be opportunities in other ways. But I agree, it's a little bit questionable. I mean, as much as an introvert as I am, whenever I've stayed in a hostel, I've tried to minimize the amount of time I've been in the hostel, so usually just to sleep. But I think that these light wells are, volumetrically, geometrically very exciting and potentially create some really lovely spaces on the inside. I also agree that there are some issues with this sort of quote unquote preservation scheme. I think that there are plenty of reasons or ways to justify why you might preserve one facade over another, or the way that you might go about preserving or restoring a certain facade. But right now, I'm not really hearing much of an intent to or like a real clear decision on that front. It seems like it was convenient in some places and inconvenient in others, and that's sort of why you went with what you did, your demolition plan. I also think that there's this sort of lack of clarity for me about materiality, which also seems like a really big missed opportunity to explore further, in part because light is so important to you. So whether it is natural daylight or artificial light, the way that light is washing over some of these surfaces could be incredibly beautiful and complex. And clearly you're interested in the sort of textured, almost lacy brick composition in your sort of rebuilt cantilevered part. And then you have these corbelled curves. If those are all masonry of some variety, that could be really interesting. But in the images that I'm seeing here, it's not clear to me what is brick and what is not brick, and what is textured, visible brick, and what is maybe plastered over or something where I see just a smooth surface. And maybe that's something you could speak to, maybe that's something you've thought about, but I think that both of those have very different qualities, both in how they're interacting with light and also how we are, sort of what it's like to experience those spaces as occupants throughout the day.
Franklin, I think your scheme is the first one I've seen today that doesn't locate any program outside of the existing shell. I do notice that you add a third level, and so you're kind of recognizing the fact that the two-story brick shell is actually, reflects very tall floors, floor-to-floor height. So you can actually fit 3 stories within that shell. Mm-hmm. So that as a strategy helps you to accommodate the program within the shell. But the part of that that's disappointing is that, especially with your statement that, your approach to the shell as a whole on the inside is that outside of the shell, the public spaces are very undeveloped. And the scheme doesn't seem to recognize the fact that the value of the shell is not just an interior condition, it's also, the texture is legible on the exterior, as well as perhaps other benefits. So, and even your renderings, your sketches, your watercolors are all within the shell. So I just point that out, not as, more as a kind of a missed opportunity, because the only place I can start to read your intent is in your AXO, your site AXO that you're showing. And, and then we get back to the decision to remove the one lower part of the wall, and which is a very disruptive move. I know we saw examples, Jeremy showed you examples of some, pretty disruptive moves by other architects when they were dealing with an existing condition like that. But it does, the bigger issue I think with your scheme is not that it's impossible, not that it's couldn't work under all costs, but I just don't see how it relates to the basic positioning or footing that you're describing for your project, with the quote that you started with. So there's just an inconsistency for me.
Quotes are a hard one. as an architect, you'll have to realize sooner rather than later that they're put in parentheses so somebody can go back and reiterate them to you or for you or against you. So you have to be very careful when you make a quote that it's the right quote.
I mean, it starts in my mind to suggest that like in the hierarchy of design moves in this project, that's the most important one. But then when I look at the project, I don't see that as your primary goal necessarily. I really see it as these sort of featured volumes that you're trying to sculpt with light and form.
I think that's a good comment to end on and keep moving. But thank you, Franklin.
Thank you.
I'm after Franklin, right?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, you're next, Emily.
Can you see it all okay? Okay, cool. Side. Okay, so the first thing I think to go through would probably be starting at the most simple where we started the design, thinking about separation of spaces. So I took a pretty straightforward approach of public on bottom and private on top, and then service spaces pushed to the back. And then I guess the other really important thing starting off with this project was how to relate to the existing wall, which I decided to take an approach of, in a narrative sense, compressing the existing wall under the weight of this new building, which expressed itself through a gestural shape on this broken wall. Then going further into the program, I decided to use that compression to create the entry sequence into the building from this active corner of the site, in through a lobby, and then an open sequence of public spaces, which would then deal backwards into circulation. Then on the second floor, this circulation space reflects into a public dining area, and then a series of smaller clusters of rooms. Then looking at the section perspective, we can see that relationship between the circulation and this public space again, and then also how this space begins to relate to the courtyard. So this creates an overhang condition in the courtyard, and then an open to the air space, similar to the existing conditions within that wall. And then we can also see the roof condition. So I decided, because all of my room clusters are lining the perimeter of the building, in order to allow more of that southern light deeper into those spaces, to curve this, to peel the roof upward to allow that light further in. And then finally, looking again at the entry condition, I kind of imagine this to be a sort of relationship of the entry condition to what's happening with this wall. So as you pass under this overhanging condition, this creates a sense of compression, which reflects back to this compression on the existing wall. And then we saw like the courtyard space in that section perspective, but this actually has three parts. So there's the overhanging space, the open to the sky space, and then this semi-shaded space, which is kind of envisioned to be like an extension of the floor structure, those floor joists reaching out, reflecting the original qualities of that existing wall and the pockets for the floor joists that existed previously. And then also looking at the module of the room, because I was very interested in how the organization of the rooms as groups could create layers of private spaces. So how that entry space, which is shared by these different rooms, could be combined to create many different opportunities for community.
So first comment, Emily, while you're getting your Miro board up, I quite like the party as an idea. The sort of, I don't mind the squashing of the building with the other building. I think that it could have been done a bit more gracefully, especially when I look at that exterior corner rendering of the two volumes interacting with one another. I wonder if the roof itself could read more, and this is not a comment on the representation, this is a comment on the actual form. I wish that the roof itself could read a bit more as an object perhaps. And right now it's this sort of, I don't know, the volumes seem kind of awkward in relationship to each other, but not in, there are awkward moments that I can get excited about, but I'm not excited enough about the awkwardness here. If that makes sense. And I think that this sort of blanket-like roof could be potentially really interesting on the interior as a, you know, the way, and you can sort of almost see it in the sectional perspective, the way that the light is hitting that ceiling and the softness. I feel like you could capitalize on that a lot more than you have. And again, it seems like something that you've thought about but haven't kind of carried all the way through yet. And I wonder if the sort of overhang of the roof from the wall, I'm not talking about the cantilever, I'm just talking about the roof to wall condition. It's not enough or it's too much, right? It's right now it feels like you're not taking a position on what it wants to be. And so there are a few design decisions like that in this building for me where it seems like you didn't make up your mind yet, or you were sort of torn between two options. And so you compromised, and compromise is not always good.
So you made two statements that were very interesting to me, and one of them was you were interested in layering private spaces. The other one was the difference between an overhang, an open space, and a shaded space. And those two statements I find very compelling, but unfortunately I don't see it. I don't see either one of those in the presentation. You know, to kind of follow up on what Talia said about the building, you know, you mentioned compression, but you know, with compression, there's a reactant tension that I don't see in this, and I actually have a problem with the thought of just sort of such a heavy-handed crushing, not compression, but actually crushing of the existing structure, because I don't think it takes into context sort of the history of the structure or the potential of the structure. It's as if there's a ignoring it and just sort of sweeping it away. So that's you know sort of a harder thought about the building just sort of being dropped on the brick and demolishing it. That's not to say that there isn't a version of it where you could overlay a heavier roof on a lighter plinth, and somehow react or play with the places where the two meet the older structure. I just think that this one is too simplistic and sort of naive in terms of the form and the implication on the site. I think if you went to a client and said, "Oh, you have this beautiful," they came to you and said, "We have this beautiful shell," and you just said, "I want to crush it," I think it would be problematic. You would have to be very bold and justified in the move to be able to do something like that. So I think that there's probably a version of it where you could do that. It's hard to see it here. The other thing is in the planning of the spaces. I think it sort of reads as if you just decided that there was a rectangle of a certain size and you wanted an inverted roof, and then fit all of the spaces inside of it, as opposed to really thinking about what it would be like to be in those spaces and how that translates to a plan, and how that plan ultimately translates to a space, and if you're lucky, a place where you actually remember the sort of sequences. You made a mention about sort of the relationship between the stair and the public space. It's not good enough to just cut a section through it. It has to sort of be imbibed with the sort of meaning behind what you're presenting. So I think it would be helpful to sort of take a look at those sort of important ideas. When I look at the one small rendering on the right of the page, where there's you have the possibility to be able to show the old, or the overhang, the open, and the shaded. When you talked about using the existing pockets of the existing masonry, when Jeremy first showed the original photo, it seemed like there was some places in the building where there were actually beam pockets, and they would have been in that type of structure. To be able to use those as an extension or some reference between the old and the new, it's not a big investment of resources to be able to make those very simple connections, and it talks to what you said about layering the open with the shaded, and I think that one small rendering is the most successful in terms of what you were saying and how it was presented. I'd like to think that there are other places or other sketches or other pieces in your semester that represent some of those other some of the other thoughts, and how could they be ultimately folded into this, into your presentation. I would be interested in seeing that.
To jump back on the comment about the room modules, I agree. I think that they seem a little bit haphazard to me, and not necessarily, they don't necessarily have this sort of layered level of privacy to them, the way that you were talking about them. I think that it could be accomplished. When I look at your little diagram of the room, I'm seeing these sort of slatted screening systems on the beds. Mm-hmm. I think that you could be a little bit more thoughtful about like what in the plan we're seeing as just a black or gray line dividing one room from another, one room from the hallway. And I think that might be an opportunity to actually create these sort of layered spaces of a sort of you are behind ultimately 6 layers of screening, but there's a sort of screen to your room. There's a screen to the sort of shared series of rooms. There's a screen to that wing, right? I don't necessarily think that works with the way that you've configured the rooms thus far, but if that is something that you're interested in, you might sort of apply this material approach to it to really create these sort of layers of space as opposed to just reads like a hotel corridor really right now.
Yeah.
Something else, Emily, that the room Axos suggests is the way that you're using the vertical space in the room. I think has more potential than you've fully exploited at this point. When I look at your second floor plan, it seems like most of the stacked bunk bed spaces are along the western facade. And then it seems like there are some larger sleeping rooms with double beds along the eastern side of the site. And I think that that's a potential area where I could imagine streamlining or reconfiguring that second floor so that more of the stacked bunk bed spaces were where that entire western facade. Maybe you don't need that large shared space on the second floor since you have so many on the ground floor. And you could maybe play with that roof shape so that instead of being quite as equitable as it is right now, it could respond to the varying heights of the organization of the rooms. So I don't know if that's clear or that makes sense, but
yeah, no, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah, so I think you have the kind of some of the pieces and parts to play with. Just could be could benefit from a more iteration or recognition of that. Are there any last comments? We're just about out of time. Is there anything, Emily, that hasn't been commented on that you'd like some feedback?
No, I think I'm good. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. So Nick is next.
Yeah. Our last presenter for the morning session. I think we've been joined by the whole yeah.
Nick, check that you are not muted.
Okay, there we go. Try that again. So hi, my name is Nick, and as I started designing this project, I really started thinking about the title of the project, Urban Regenerator, and I wanted to find a way to find a focus on a central space that allowed both the community and the hostel guests to interact. So I landed on an arced form as a sort of a primary move, and that contrasts the shell. It also signifies an importance to the sort of central space of it, and it allows for circulation around it. So this partie is sort of a simplification of the scheme that shows how this arced form sort of passes through and spans across the existing shell. As we look at sort of the ground floor plan, the red sort of indicates this the main circulation through the space, and how it comes sort of from the street. We almost bring the street into the site to create an entrance area, and then into the shell where there's a communal space primarily. So you almost are creating an inside-outside space. And the arced form continues its way up through the second and also the third floor. Diagrammatically, all the sort of program specific spaces and private spaces, service spaces, sort of link on to this arced form in a series of levels, with the sleeping spaces being on the second and third floor, creating a sort of piano nobile effect. And structurally, it relies on a series of sort of columns and walls that fall in one orientation across the arced form. As we look at the section perspective, we can see how there's sort of a unification of the inside and the outside space, and how the inside shell sort of has both objects inside of it that become the private spaces, but a large sort of shared communal space. Looking from the street, you start to see how this settles into the neighborhood. While it largely occupies a large mass outside of the shell, this is somewhat intentional because I don't want the bedrooms which are in that space to be sort of sanitized from the urban condition. Even though you come in and there's much insulation, I wanted the bedrooms to still sort of come back out towards the street a little bit. As we come inside, we see how this arc circulation allows people to have to engage this sort of communal space and the activity that might be happening there. Anytime they sort of are going up and down or coming from one space to another, they're going to come along this arc and sort of engage with what's happening. Here we look at the second floor plan. There's a courtyard, which is over here, which becomes sort of the private courtyard. Even though this on the first floor is sort of an entry courtyard, there's also one that becomes more private, which you pass through and actually can engage a quiet space, since there isn't much of that in sort of the main area. Here you get a glimpse from that private space that can be used sort of as a quiet, reflective space to do some business. It can be multifunctional and looking out into this sort of more private courtyard with the sort of communal space beyond. As we see how the arced space sort of engages with the bedrooms and the sort of the private bathrooms, we can see how the various rooms sort of engage the shell. And on the outside, where there's going to be circulation between bedrooms and possibly bathrooms, there's a little more privacy created through this screen, but you still have transparency out to sort of to engage with the communal space in the community. Here we can see how the bedrooms start to manifest. The sleeping spaces are all intimate little pods. In one larger area, there's 18 groups of 18 of these pods grouped together. The idea is to not try to create so much privacy or such a luxurious room that you are spending your time there. These are more utilitarian so that people go back to the communal space, back to where the community and the hostel guests could interact. Here we see that one more time as we move back out from the bedrooms down through the communal space. And once more, we see the outside where, in an attempt to acknowledge the neighborhood and it's sort of this building's position in the neighborhood, the roof has taken on a shape that acknowledges the base of this valley. And we can see diagrammatically here how this building is really placed at the center of this valley, and just a subtle sort of acknowledgement of that with this roof, which has a low point in the center as all the objects come together. And there, thank you. I'll switch over to Miro here.
I think this is a very strong scheme, both from the smallest scale up to the largest scale. Can folks hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good, good, good. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Did you consider having these arc shapes inflect the plan more strongly? I mean, your thought is that there are these sort of singular interventions that have a different quality on each floor. Yet the plans that are adjacent to them are interrupted by them, but aren't changed by them. Did you consider having?
I did a little bit in my initial exploration. I think I was yearning for a contrast between sort of the rooms as something sort of outboard that sort of plugs into this arc circulation versus something that sort of spawns from it, so that there was a sort of a transitional space. It's relatively subtle, but here there's sort of these sleeves which actually compress you both sort of in both directions as you go between the hallway and the whatever sleeping space there is or a bedroom, and they would be a different material, a darker material, and so you would have this transition space between the sort of arc and then the orthogonal sort of simpler rooms.
Did you consider connecting these arced elements one to another between one floor and the next, rather than expressing each one independently?
Yeah, I actually spent a lot of time on that. For me, and the scale I was working at and where I had ended up with a lot of things, I had a lot of trouble trying to actually get the pieces to fit with that and not be so sort of consuming of space that they became almost this overwhelming sculptural element. Even at one point, I had this sort of sculptural spiral stair that sort of navigated from one arc to another. that came into this central space. So I still think maybe there's a way to do that that would be interesting, but I certainly, after a while of exploring, couldn't quite find something I was ever satisfied with.
I love your scheme. I think the section that you show at the very end is really strong, showing the connection to the community. You know, I had just one thought. It's almost as though, and this is just for me, these arcs that you're showing as your partee, I don't think they're actually your partee. I think the partee is the resulting curved shape that I'm looking at that forms that very nice section next to your logo on the left side of the page. It seems to me that these arcs are the results of that space creation strategy.
Interesting,
and, that may help you as you would push the shape forward. But again, congratulations on the materials, the diagrams, the system-based architecture, the relationship of the new to the old, and the formal expression of the thing.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, Nick, I think the sort of interface, the public interface that you have, the sort of exterior courtyard space and main entry, and even just how the building sits on the various elevations, the various streets, I think is really thoughtful and one of the most nuanced that I've seen so far, one of the most believable plazas, frankly, that I've seen so far. And I appreciate how it is both, although it is very open, it feels quite protected and really seems to draw you in to the interior of the building. I think that some of the moments that I'm having trouble with in this building are more, they seem like they were residual and so therefore they're not quite developed all the way yet. One of the things that I sort of question is the weird leftover space that you get that seems quite substantial in some places and then maybe a little tighter in others. Now that I'm looking at it, maybe it's like 3 to 5 feet between like the tubes and the ceiling above of the roof, you know, the kind of roof mass that you have. Let's see if I can probably, if you zoom into your section, let's see if I know how to do this annotation. Annotation is not working for me right now, but if you turn on the cursors, I can show you where it is on the Miro board because I am on there too.
I can see your cursor.
You can see my cursor.
Be able to see, yeah, it should come across when you. I mean, I can see the little label in the corner. So
okay, so I'm not seeing my cursor on your screen, but
that's fine. I see lots of cursors, maybe not yours.
Anyway, all I was going to say is the sort of the relationship between the ceiling and the roof, or the sort of floor plate and the kind of line of the tube below it. Those spaces seem a little bit just left over to me, and I think that it's all right to have these sort of in between spaces that are not occupiable, and you're just sort of registering them. But I think that they could be an opportunity to sort of play with the exterior light a bit more, or maybe how they're represented materially is a little bit different. And I'm sort of seeing that in some of the renderings, but again, just I think something that could use a little bit more development.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I really appreciate this sort of the clarity of the scheme in general, and this sort of the relationship between the parts, I think is really well developed. So I would commend you on that.
Thanks.
Yeah, something else I was going to say, but I can't remember. So
I was going to say too that I appreciate the fact that the the thought process is carried through the sort of the big over idea, and then it's taken to all the multiple levels, down to the plaza being represented as a extension of the community, the possibility of bringing some public space or public use space into the courtyard, even that very subtle reference to the valley. It shows that there's sort of a holistic way of looking at the program and the site. I guess when I see a big red line, my initial thought is to question where that line came from. So it's not necessarily a criticism on big red lines, but I wonder why that particular arc and that particular, or not, let's say, why not a zigzag, or why not a straight line, or where this arc comes from when it's so prominent in the design. I question that. If it wasn't an arc, if it was something else, are the ideas still strong enough to carry through if it was a different shape per se? And I think it goes to what Talia was saying, is that when you overlay a big move like that, it's sometimes hard to resolve all of the little tiny pieces. And
absolutely.
You're left with leftover spaces, as opposed to, I think, what we would strive to do, which is these sort of interstitial spaces that are layered between two spaces, and they represent a piece of both, as opposed to just something that's part of a diagram but doesn't really work. In terms of the plaza, I think it's very successful relative to some of the other presentations about engaging that corner, the street, and creating what is a usable yet protected plaza area. In terms of the volumes on the plaza towards the main street there, I see that very long white wall with a beam cantilevering out, and I question that particular piece of the scheme. Where your hand is there, that I think there's probably a more subtle way of sort of terminating the box in the context of the space that's created towards the old building. There's something there. I mean, it may still have to hold up a heavy box, and it seems like you've more successfully than some of the other presentations represented the thickness of the structure that's needed to be able to do some of the moves. And then, the one other comment is just the sort of the placing of this volume on top of the other box. I think there's a lot to be said about how you I see in the rendering there that you're sort of putting this volume on top of it, but you're allowing it to be it's separate in its own thing. And I think anytime when you have an old building, you have to be very careful on how you place something on another building, and I think this one is more successful. There is one thing that you mentioned that I took a little bit of note of, and you mentioned that the private spaces, you were trying to make them a little tighter to encourage. I don't think you use encourage. I think that was my word, but to basically force people to go outside and use the public space. And I think it's a hard. You have to be very careful when you design that way, that somehow, architecture should encourage, it shouldn't force, right? So the spaces shouldn't be so tight and dismal that you just got to get out of it. When you think of a hostel, that's the one thing you want after a weary day of travel is a nice, comfortable space. And I think in general, all of the projects took a lot of liberty with the public space, but they didn't take as much focus to these small spaces that are created, which are ultimately the basic program of the project. And I see, you have, and there probably are other thoughts, and there are probably other smaller drawings that are showing, a developed thought about these little pods or furniture cassette things that that the sleeping spaces. And I think it does a disservice if you have that as a thought, but then you say, you know, no, I want to basically force them out into the public part.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess my I should elaborate, but I appreciate really what you're saying there. I suppose my thought was, for instance, at one version, I was trying to use some of these slipping volumes to create maybe balconies or other kinds of like upper level sort of outdoor space. And I sort of shied away from that eventually because I was realizing that that's sort of a draw, something that's going to pull someone to that space and maybe to linger there longer and not go back and see what's happening in the communal space. So that's sort of where that language came from. But I definitely see what you're saying about A, encouraging, I appreciate that, and B, sort of still thinking about it and putting the sort of energy and effort into that main program.
Yeah, I don't know if is Jeremy on here and are you there? Yeah, he's there. I wonder, I don't know how you all will ultimately kind of circle back. I just think, and given the context of what's happening around the world right now, I wonder how just the basic premise of the hostel, how the discussion about the hostel changes in this sort of post-pandemic world, and this idea of closeness and sort of, you know, the way I remember it when we were traveling around was it was pretty unsanitary to begin with, but this idea of how the program is affected forever. I mean, this kind of program is forever affected by what's happening right now, and how that changes thought process about closed space and small space, common areas, and public spaces. I just think that this particular program, it has a whole nother life in the context of what's happening right now. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, it speaks to the basic premise of what we do as architects, right? We're constantly assessing environment situations and having to make trajectory changes in terms of how we think about them. And this is it's, you know, if I'm sure that in some way there will be some positives that come out of all of this. And I don't know I don't know what the hell they are right now because I can't see many right now. But in terms of you know, design professionals, there certainly is an immediate sort of readjustment that has to be thought about, and it's unique because, you know, we went our entire education and we never thought of it this way, but they're, you know, the students now are in a position where they have to add that to the list of things that they have to sort of juggle in terms of how they approach a project, and it's just an interesting phenomenon right now.
No, not at all.
You know, speaking of the last 2 months, I remember teaching in the late 80s as the wall was going down in Berlin. And at the time I was teaching an S-Bahnhof construction, a subway station in Berlin as the wall was coming down. And the act of the wall coming down changed all of the students' projects. On the other hand, I get it that this occurred in the middle of the project, and to ask the students to radically reformulate the idea of hostel in the middle of the design process could be harmful for the development of the projects. But thinking about that project from the 80s makes me think a lot about the language that we were using at the time. And at that point, the students were mostly employing a kind of neo-rationalist, very logical language of blocks and forms. But then when I moved to LA and I was teaching there, and at Woodbury and a couple other schools, there was this sort of Gumby language of bendy, formy, crazy stuff. And then when I started teaching at CMU, the language has changed here as well. And the projects I'm seeing here are by no means radical in their formal conception, even as they're addressing the incredibly complex matrix of situations, including interiority and sleeping, and Jeremy, all the things that you've been talking about. But it makes me think, as I've seen all of these different languages, that the formal expression of the projects at the end, what I'm looking at here in terms of form, in terms of the development of the students, isn't as important as all these things, Jeremy, that you were talking about, all of these different sort of issues for exploration. And as a result, I think the conversations that we've been having have been very interesting on the different projects. And I can't place a value judgment saying that one language or method of expression or level of craziness or whatever is better than another.
I mean, you know my position on computers, so I'll say that I understand the need, and particularly in this case for the students to have that complete fluency in the computer programs, and it does speak a lot to when you leave school, you don't have all those great tools. Typically, you don't have all those great tools, and ultimately, you know, this is still the most important thing that any student can learn how to use, because when this runs out of ink, you just go buy another one for $1. And it's difficult. There's a bigger conversation in terms of architecture school and students coming out of architecture school. But that hands-on making and that closeness to material is something that if schools, they have to do that. They have to somehow figure out how to give students that sort of want and need to make things and to understand the act of making and craft. And it's difficult. It's difficult because I'll tell you just flat out, we get 30 or 40 resumes a week, and the majority of them are beautiful clouds and beautiful cars and beautiful people, and then a little tiny building, right? And that's something that it's so hard. It's so hard to understand from our education how that's the mechanism in which students now present their work. And it's a difficult one because I understand that you have to have those skills to be able to get a job, but somehow you have to actually have the knowledge of design to be able to use the tools correctly and all of that. You guys have a tremendously difficult task in this day and age with the amount of programs and software and language that you have to give the students, because you can actually give that to them. Something you can actually teach, but at the same time, encourage students to learn how to teach themselves all the other things, which are the questions, the reasons, the management skills, the holistic thinking. That's the thing that ultimately will transcend whether you have a laser cutter in your office or you have a 3D printer or a milling machine or a shop. Ultimately this is still the most important thing, and it's a difficult question. Anyway, that's my thought.
I think to add to some of those comments, I think a lot of the questions that we were asking today, or at least a lot of the questions that I was asking today, had to do with sort of larger design intent, and or how different pieces, different materials started to come together and interact with each other. And I think both of those issues could have been addressed through other forms of representation that were underrepresented here. And that's not to say that there aren't sort of digital counterpoints to them, but how different materials come together obviously can be represented in a drawing. Often, especially in second year, you're exploring things like that through model making. And I think it's clear that when you're working in Rhino primarily or other software programs, it's really easy to not think about at all. Whereas when you're making a physical model, it's always present. So there are issues like that I think could have been, I could have anticipated those sort of lacking here. I think also similarly, these questions of bigger design intent, a lot of these presentations, as beautiful as some of the drawings were, personally, I had some trouble with the lack of hierarchy between different drawings. Everything was often of a similar size, which is not usually the case if you're presenting a physical series of drawings. So what other graphic or representational techniques can you use to sort of help us to both connect between different drawings and also to understand what might be sort of the most important element of a particular drawing or of all the drawings on your board. These are, I think, really foundational skills that you guys all have and maybe sometimes take for granted, but through this presentation format, I think it's easy to forget about them. But I would just say, in general, very impressed with the work, considering everything that you guys have gone through. I know that this has been a really difficult second half of the semester, just with all the complications. So I would commend you for all your hard work.
Well, it's very similar to a competition, right? You're not there to explain your competition entry. It has to stand on its own. So it forces the students to use the real estate of the page to convey, what's in their head. It can't be in their head. It's got to be, it's either in the drawing or not in the drawing. And obviously, it's second year. It's hard to do that. It's hard to do that now, even at 47 years. It's still hard to do that, but I mean, that's ultimately what you're talking about. You're talking about a piece of architecture stands on its own, and it doesn't have the architect to walk you around 99% of the time. Those moments and those layers have to be apparent, and that's ultimately the hardest. It's the thing that we do every day, and it's the hardest thing to do every day. Is make the drawings convey something that they aren't, which is a built space. It's not so easy.
I'll chime in. Just I saw most of it and didn't want to interrupt the other reviewers. I'm Kai. I teach in the school as well. I think the Miro board as a sort of whole set of drawings is a really useful tool. And when the students sort of take over and then show us one slide at a time, that does provide a narrative, but to be able to sort of also see other drawings at the same time. So I think that's something we need to work on for reviewers as well as students, so that we see sort of what the student is talking about, but also as in when we're present in front of the whole board, we can also quickly jot our eyes to the plan or to the section or to the model someday. So I think sort of getting that balance correct, where the reviewers have the ability to focus in, as I am now, and also see what the student's saying. The other thing is, I think one of the pieces that I didn't see very many drawings of, it's difficult to do, but I think encourage the students now at the end of your second year to take some of the experience from the first half of the semester of molding something with your hands that's flexible or malleable, putting sticks together, folding something, is to use some of that tactile haptic sensibility to, if not actually make something at home using a napkin or a straw or a piece of cardboard that you can find around, perhaps to model at a different scale some of the physical material things. So what I'm missing is a sort of view of something that gets put together. It's not a floor plan, it's not a section of the whole building, it's not a view of the neighborhood, but it's something at the scale of a sort of door frame, or perhaps the wall section, or something about how two materials come together. That's difficult to do without a lot of experience. It's more wonderful in model, but I think we can learn to draw that, and then we can hopefully sort of add to our understanding of a project. I'm looking at Nick's here, and I think most of them had that sort of at the scale of the building and the room, and maybe even the sort of neighborhood, it works pretty well, but I'm wanting that material sense. And I don't think that has to come only through a model. I think we can draw the sort of corner detail or something like that.
You know, one of the advantages of working in model is that you can more easily, when you're not so experienced working with all of the software we have, develop a hierarchy of forms. I used to focus so much on the details of the computer models. It was at the expense of the overall picture that becomes clear really with a physical model. And Kai, to your thought about what we can see and what we can't see as critics as we're looking at these boards, my thought is that it would be nice to be able to follow the process of the students so that I could understand their intent better. And what's sometimes missing in these presentations is some idea of where the students have been in the past. It's more of a snapshot of a single moment in time.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thanks.